live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the episode Errand of Mercy. This is a really interesting one because if you situate this episode within the sort of geopolitical universe of Star Trek, we have a condemnation not just of the Soviet Union, but of the Cold War as such. So basically what happens in this episode is that talks between the Klingons and the Federation break down, war is declared, and the Enterprise has to go to this planet in disputed territory called Organia, and they have to Kirk and Spock have to try and convince the Organians to side with the Federation against the Klingons. While the Organians, for their part, are like, we're just not really worried about it. It's not actually a serious issue. While Kirk and Spock are on the planet, a group of Klingon warships show up in orbit. Sulu has orders to get the Enterprise out of there, get the Starfleet fleet, and bring them back and fight the Klingons with multiple ships, rather than the Enterprise trying to take on a whole Klingon fleet. So that's what he does. The Enterprise is gone. Kirk and Spock stranded on this planet with this population that's just like, yeah, we're not even worried. Sure, the Klingons may come. We don't care. And Kirk can't figure this out. He can't wrap his mind around the attitude that the Organians take. He gets even more unable to wrap his mind around things when Commander Coon shows up, the leader of the Klingons, or the new military governor specifically. Coon arrives with an occupation force. He establishes a fairly brutal military dictatorship to control the Organians. The Organians are like, okay, we will obey your rules, no worries. Coon doesn't understand this, so he and Kirk are equally confused about the general sort of apathy that the Organians have. Spock gets taken... So Kirk gets disguised as an Organian, Spock is disguised as a spice merchant, a Vulcan spice merchant or something like this. He gets interrogated by the Mind Ripper, which is a Klingon tool that sifts the mind to find the truth, etc., etc. Spock is able to defeat it, basically. But then, when Kirk and Spock blow up a Klingon ammo dump, the Organians turn Kirk and Spock over, and basically the reason that they do this is because otherwise the Klingons would kill them, basically. So with the intention of keeping Kirk and Spock alive, the leader, or the Council of Organians, informs Core who Kirk and Spock are. So they become prisoners. Kirk and Spock have a little tete-a-tete in Core's office, some chatting, etc., etc. Then Kirk gets put in the prison cell with Spock, at which point, about 6 hours later, apparently, the leader of the Organian Council comes to get them. Basically, he comes into the prison and he's like, the Klingons intend to harm you, and so we're gonna take you out. That happens. Kirk doesn't really understand how the Organian got past all the Klingon guards, but it has happened. Then Kirk and Spock take their phasers from the Organians, and they're like, we're going to go take on the Klingons by ourselves. And maybe this will show you how to be men, or whatever macho bullshit it is. And the Organians are like, but you shouldn't do that. And Kirk and Spock are like, well, we're going to. So they go, they take out a bunch of Klingon guards. They get to Core's office. They're kind of holding Core hostage, at which point Core is like, did you know that all Klingons are always under surveillance? Even a military governor. Ha, security cam. At which point a bunch of random Klingon henchmen bust in. Everybody's about to start blasting when all their weapons are suddenly, instantaneously superheated to 350 degrees, so they all drop their weapons. Then they go for like, fisticuffs time. But whenever they try to touch one of the other people, they are 350 degrees as well. We see up on the Enterprise, all of the instrument panels and whatever have become 350 degrees. It's crazy. Just madness. Kirk and Core are like, what the fuck is going on here? At which point the Organians show up and they're like, yeah, so we really don't like violence of any kind, so we're not going to let you have a war. And Kirk and Core basically are both like, you can't do that. You don't have the right to interfere in our war. And the Organians are like, no, we don't. We find it abhorrent to interfere in the business of other beings, but your war will kill millions for no good reason. Eventually, you will have peace, and the Federation and the Klingons will be friends. We are not going to let you have a war in which millions will die. So, throughout the galaxy, all Federation military forces, all Klingon military forces are neutralized. We, by the way, despite our whole primitive medieval setup that we've got going here, which is for your benefit, we are actually super advanced energy beings that exist as pure consciousness. We don't really want you on our planet anymore, so get to stepping. At which point, Kirk and Core are kind of like, well, I guess we can't have a war, so bye. And that's more or less the episode. Now, what's really, really interesting here is that in the sort of geopolitical schema of Star Trek, Cold War, right? This is 1967, this episode comes out. The Federation is NATO. The US, NATO, the Western Bloc. The Vulcans are basically the Japanese. Interestingly enough, they're an ally. And they are similar to the Romulans, who are the People's Republic of China. So they are an enemy of the Federation, but they're not the primary antagonist. And then the Klingons, who are the primary antagonist in the galaxy of the Federation, they are the Soviets. So the Federation stands for democracy and liberalism, freedom, individualism, etc., but also backs it up with military force. The Klingons are imperialistic, they are controlling, they are militaristic, etc., which is not necessarily exactly a fair depiction of the Soviets, but from the US perspective in 1967, probably seemed quite accurate. But they represent sort of the opposite values, particularly militarism, conquest, expansion, domination, etc., What's really striking about the episode An Errand of Mercy is how similar Kirk and Coon actually are. Coon actually points this out. He basically says, you and I are the same. And Kirk is like, we're nothing alike. We believe in democracy. And Coon says, I'm not talking about minor ideological differences. I'm talking about us as predators, as hunters. Kirk, in fact, earlier in this episode, when he was addressing the Council of Organia, had said, I'm not a diplomat, I'm a soldier. So it's interesting because if the Federation represents NATO and the Klingons represent the Soviets, we have here the two sides of the Cold War in a war that is about to get hot. And there's no meaningful distinction between their positions. There's no meaningful distinction between Kirk and Coon's attitude toward violence, between their desire to have a war, even though it's relatively pointless, even though millions will die, etc., That critique of the fact that it takes at least two sides to have a military conflict is really quite startling in 1967. That idea that maybe what the US is doing in the Cold War is not necessarily as good as American propaganda might make it out to be. Maybe, in fact, the fact that the US, that NATO is engaging in military brinksmanship. Remember, it was not all that long before this episode that you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, that you had the Bay of Pigs invasion. These things that really, really, really threatened to spark a global nuclear war. So this was on people's mind. And that critique that maybe the US, maybe NATO engaging in the same kind of brinksmanship that the Soviets are engaging in, maybe we are as much to blame for the Cold War. That's a really, really drastic critique of the entire narrative of good versus them, or good versus evil, us versus them, freedom versus communism, etc., It's a really, really surprising bit of commentary on that set of international politics.